Greetings, you admirable and damnable accursed. Thanks as always for being here for our brand of political analysis, which we like to think of as insight born of experience and swears born of a dwindling vocabulary. I'm David Herle, he's Scott Reid, and sitting in the guest panelist chair this week, our friend and our sometimes foe, Kory Teneycke. Kory's appeared on our sister pod, the Herle Burley, a couple of times now, and his episodes always pull huge audiences. So Scott and I, being craven opportunists, our thought process went something like this. Hey, let's get Kory over on Curse of Politics and pull some huge numbers so we can convince ourselves that we're way more fucking popular than we actually are. You all know Mr. Teneycke, amongst a long list of accomplishments, former comms director to Prime Minister Stephen Harper and winning campaign manager for Doug Ford in both 2018 and 2022. Saskatchewan boy, rider fan, perfect hair. If he wasn't a conservative, I might date him, for Christ's sake. All right, here's what's on our agenda this week. We're going to break down Doug Ford's messaging on healthcare in Ontario. What does it mean? Where are we headed? Did the bee survive its trip through Ford's esophagus? What do we expect to see from the Prime Minister post-vacation? Same Trudeau, feistier Trudeau, and what might timing be like for the next election? Our cursed clipping is Andrew Coyne's piece in the Globe and Mail on Danielle Smith, and Gordon Pinsent will help us bring the pod to a close with our Hey Yous. Kory, I want to thank you for bringing your legions of Teneycke acolytes to us on the curse. How the hell are you guys today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here.
It's great. I feel very prairie conscious. I'm very notion. I'm very aware of my central Canadian roots being bookended by you two Saskatchewanians. So,
Kory was just back in Saskatchewan. How was it?
Oh, it's great. It's always great to be back in Saskatchewan. It was super hot in terms of the temperature. So it's all the farmers were happy. Lots of crop coming off. I actually think the province is going to have a spectacular year financially for the provincial government as a result of high grain prices, thanks to the conflict in Ukraine and other things, which is,
and a big crop.
And a big crop. And
gas will draw in lots of revenue.
Yeah. Like I'm hearing huge surplus numbers as a possibility for the province, which is nice to see because David, I know you remember the days as I do, of Saskatchewan being one of the have-naughtiest of the have-not provinces, and
that's when I lived there. Well. Turned around as soon as I left. That's the case when I lived
right. There. You know what I say?
I don't know.
You know what I always say? If it's good for Scott Moe, then it's good for Canada. So congratulations.
You know, Kory, when I finished fourth in Rosetown Elrose in the 1982 provincial election, it did not occur to me that my next move should be to run for mayor of Rosetown.
Yeah, that would be a surprising move on your part.
but that is apparently the path now. Yeah, I should have understood that, right?
Yeah, it's we're seeing multiple examples, right? So
it's like a farm system for sports or something. If you can't make the pros, you go down to AAA. You can't make AAA.
Yeah, well, I guess, we're is part of it not that we're just seeing more and more of politics being chosen as a profession, and professional politicians, if you're not making it in one league, you might move down a league. But I think there's something to that. It's been a phenomenon south of the border for a long time, and I think it's creeping its way up here increasingly.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's get to it. The biggest news in Canadian politics has been the dribbling out over the past week or so, culminating in an announcement today by the Ford government of its plan for healthcare. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of it is an increased reliance on private surgery and care clinics. How's this going to go over? Which one of you wants to take this on? How's this going to go?
You go first, Scott.
The politics of it. So I'll avoid going into some kind of deep dive policy analysis. And that's not because I am unable to. It's not because the complexities of healthcare escape me. Right? If you want to go toe-to-toe and limb to limb, I'm your man, okay? So I know this stuff, and don't you dare think I don't. But on the politics of it, first of all, it does, it frustrates me, right? Like, I'm frustrated by... I'm always suspicious This is a hot fastball to start, Kory. Sorry when you're on, so I'm being impolite.
Yeah,
but I'm
no,
always suspicious of politicians, right? Who declare that they're forced to take a measure that also just conveniently corresponds to what they always wanted to do. And so, my suspicion and my aggravation is that we hear people saying the system is broken, the status quo is unsustainable, and therefore we're going to have to do these things. And I don't think the system is broken. And I don't think the status quo has to be unsustainable. I think there are remedies. Obviously, there needs to be change in the system. Obviously, there needs to be innovation. There never isn't, by the way. Like every single year, there's all sorts of change and motion and all sorts of activity in the healthcare system in every province, and particularly Ontario. And I have worked for the Ministry of Health pretty close up over the years off and on. And so you see all of that happening. But, to me...
Currently off, I would imagine.
Yeah, you know what? Sylvia, call me. But I would say a couple things politically. So I always get a little frustrated when, I see a government like Doug Ford's, which I think is very happy to introduce elements of private delivery, and there's nothing wrong with private delivery. That is actually the backbone of a lot of elements of our system. But expanding that and then saying we got no choice but to do this, right? It's kind of like I left the dog out in the backyard, didn't feed it for 3 weeks, and I come out and I go, my God, this dog is unsustainable. It's starving to death. Well, no fucking kidding. But all that said, I think the politics of this are going to be less combustible than people think, and for two reasons. One, they're doing it at the right time. What do I mean by that? Well, they got the benefit of timing in that people are frustrated, that the system is in stress, it's in great distress, and so people say, I need some fixes. And I don't know that this package of remedies is going to be particularly overwhelming, but they've got cover as long as they don't breach certain sort of fundamental boundaries. The second reason that the timing works for them, I think, is that they've just come off a big victory. They've got lots of time and they've got lots of political space to maneuver. Even if some things get a little choppy, they won't face an immediate consequence. And part of that, of course, is they don't face any real opposition. They've got a tremendously weakened Liberal Party without a leader. The NDP have no leader. And so I think all of that, gives them quite a bit of free hand. The boundary to all of this, of course, though, is that you've got to keep it at single user. I think that, people can throw around the words privatization.
Single payer, you mean? Single payer?
Single payer system, sorry. And that's why I think Ford and those guys are saying after I think a couple of rough days, Sylvia Jones, by the way, not reassuring me that she's going to be the political superstar communicator that she was billed to be, but Ford coming out pretty quickly after those first couple of choppy days and saying, you'll never need your credit card. It's always going to go through OHIP. What's that mean? Always going to go through OHIP means that single payer is their line in the sand. And they know that line still leaves them plenty of room to introduce all sorts of experimentation and change. Lots of stuff that I think, you want to keep a very close eye on, because some of them I think is going to be more pernicious than others. But politically, I don't think they're going to find themselves in real jeopardy unless somebody in the opposition finds a soapbox and the wit and the communications capacity to really wind people up about it.
Yeah, the opposition, though, isn't just leaderless, it's rudderless at the moment. So
in both parties, I would say.
Absolutely, in both parties. So, Kory, my sense from the polling I've done over the years is that there are 5 principles of the Canada Health Act. 2 of them nobody can name. 2 of them are inviolate.
Zeppo is one of them, right?
What?
Zeppo? Is that the one you can't name?
Yeah, no. But no, 2 of them nobody can name, and 2 of them are you can't be touched. Single payer and universal access. The 5th of them, public administration, I find public opinion more ambivalent about. And more, not that people don't care, as they don't know whether they should care necessarily, but it's not the third rail that, say, 2-tier is in terms of violating single payer. What's your sense of all that?
It's the same as yours, David. I think people are informed by their own personal experience in terms of how good the government is at delivering things. Try to do any number of basic transactions, say get your passport renewed, and see how good public administration is at delivery of things. There is a baked in skepticism that government doesn't equal efficiency, government doesn't equal customer service success. So I think there's a lot of openness to that. There's also a lot of private delivery of various healthcare services that people are very familiar with, whether it's going to an optometrist or a dentist or dealing with a pharmacist. These are all parts of our healthcare system too. And if you had to say, who fared better, the public health officials on vaccine distribution or the privately owned and operated pharmacies, like clearly the pharmacies did a better job. So I think there's a lot of openness on that. I would say that the proposals
surgery's a real extension of it, though, eh? Surgery's
a
real.
But the Schuldeis Clinic, for instance, has been operating for decades. It's a private clinic, and I don't know, how many hundreds of thousands of people have had a hernia operated on at the Schuldeis Clinic over the course of its operation, like many. So, I don't think it's radical. I thought that. I think the larger challenges around this, are more what you were talking about on the hurly-burly with the former premiers. Like, there is an unsustainability of the system, but it's around funding. It's around what role does the federal government play on that side of things, and to what extent does it allow experimentation and innovation to happen in the system. And I think that as long as you're not touching single payer, I think there's a lot of room to operate in, and I think there's a lot of latitude to operate in with the public as well. If you go after single payer, the numbers go south so fast that even if a government were to start down that road, without a major comms effort, like I can't see anyone not blinking before actually executing that in a large scale way. So, I guess I basically agree on that. I think the biggest and most controversial change that didn't really get a lot of attention was just about around moving people into long-term care. And that's, but it affects a very limited number of people, but that's been a very serious problem. And that's something that changed under the Wynne government. And I think was a mistake, allowing people to basically sit in hospitals because the long-term care facility that they want doesn't have an opening and can sort of stay in the hospital system at 4 times the cost indefinitely. And that's a challenge. I think there has to be some reasonableness in terms of how that's approached. Like, you can't put somebody in a long-term care facility on the other side of the province, or things like that. Or you don't want to separate spouses who might both be in long-term care. Like, there's a whole lot of things you got to be sensitive to. But I think we can't have thousands of hospital beds taken up by people who should be in a long-term care facility. It's just a really huge drain on our hospital resources and for no added benefit.
Canada is big. I don't need to tell you hurly-burlyites that, because like me, you still remember it being drummed into you in grades 4 through 7 geography. Mountainous and craggy, flat and arid, fertile and lush, harsh and unforgiving. Diverse is the word, with much of our population crammed into a long nationwide ribbon of urban communities within 100 kilometers of the U.S. border. But this is an ad from your presenting sponsor, Telus, you're now realizing, and you've been talking about spectrum policy for weeks now. What does this have to do with spectrum policy? Well, thanks for asking. Only everything. Canada's rural, remote, and Indigenous communities rely heavily on spectrum. That is wireless, high-speed connectivity, because running fiber optic cables to every single premises just isn't feasible over massive distances and unforgiving terrain. Remember, the goal of our social policy in the digital space is that every Canadian should have equal access to high-speed connectivity no matter where they live. Telus is already the leader in connecting rural communities, but they're here to tell you that we need to look at the evidence of whether current government policies are leading to those social outcomes, like rural connectivity, because there's still a lot of work to do. Here's the rub. Right now, the way the government auctions available spectrum makes the stuff less accessible and more costly than any other international country. 15 times more expensive than the UK, Germany, and France. 3 times the record-breaking prices paid in the US. That's like putting an enormous tax on something that's already expensive to build. It slows the process tremendously. And it's a clear disconnect in practical terms from the social objective the government is trying to achieve. Hurly-burlyites, the evidence is really clear that there's an overwhelming number of benchmark countries around the world who are getting spectrum auctioning done in ways that are far cheaper and far faster. And as a result of that head start, they're wiping the floor with us in the innovation economy. I'll start telling those stories next week. Scott, when the Minister of Long-Term Care, Paul Calandra, was asked this morning whether they would force people to leave hospitals and go into long-term care homes, he did his best Calandra, which is to say the answer was indecipherable. This is where the rubber's going to hit the road on this, isn't it? I mean, who the hell would volunteer to do that?
For sure it will. And the challenge when it comes to moving from the politics of this stuff to the delivery of this stuff is that you bump into these human realities, and it takes one story with 2 examples to blow you to the moon. So Calandra was right to prevaricate and to smother it in words and to make it indecipherable, because I think there's a mistake that conservatives sometimes make. There's lots of mistakes that lots of political parties make, but one that conservatives sometimes make is they think that people are thirsting for radical change in the system because they sit around at the Albany Club or wherever the Christ it is, and they talk themselves into, well, this is finally we got to slay this sacred cow. And the reality is, no. If you're going to introduce
don't find
change,
the radicals at the Albany Club anymore.
No, that's right. That's right. No,
they're a little too old to be radical.
Speaking of long-term care, but it's, to me, the principle there is do it, don't declare it. Right. And I know that people will just rise up in anger. Right. But to me, I think you got to be, if you proudly run into the main square and say, we're going to be doing this, and you know what, we're going to be moving people around, and this makes sense because it relieves pressure on hospital resources. And then you get one story that says, yeah, you know what, Agnes can't be in the same home any longer as Harold. Because they were moved to different places, and daughter of Agnes and Harold is fit to be tied. That blows all that up, and so you got to prevaricate. And there's, this stuff. It stays really tricky. I'll just say 2 things. One, I do think Kory makes an important point, and the premiers last week on the Hurly-burly made an important point. The federal government can try to say, look, this thing feels like it's ticking like a bomb under the dinner table, and I don't want to reach into that briefcase. But I really think that if they want, if they want to alter this conversation, they're going to have to come with a big.
They got no moral authority right now. Who gives a shit what they say?
Exactly. So if they want to participate in this discussion, they don't like the direction of this, and they want to get credit for altering the direction of this, then they're going to have to come with a big check and a big fight, because they'll have to say, in order to give you this money, we're going to require conditions. That ain't going to go well with Quebec, but that ain't going to go well with a lot of places. So you're going to have that kind of debate. The second thing I would say is, today's reforms still, in my view, miss a vital factor, right? I mean, the paramedic stuff, you look at it and you go, well, that only makes sense. Why wouldn't you be allowed to take them someplace else, or whatever? And what do I know? But it misses the fundamental, we have a nursing crisis. We have a human health resources crisis, particularly in Ontario right now, for all the reasons that everybody knows, pandemic and fatigue and burnout and all that kind of stuff. And to say, look, you know what, we've asked our nurses to do too much and pay them too little. So now we're going to ask our paramedics to do more, and we're not going to pay them anymore either. This is pushing the problem to a different column.
But is that fair, though, Scott? The government has hired thousands and thousands more nurses, and is trying to hire thousands and thousands more. Nat. One of the most interesting commitments.
I read a stat today. There's a couple of hundred more nurses in the system than there. There's a few hundred more nurses in the system now than there were in 2018.
With an uncomfortably large number who are in a potential position to retire. My cousin just decided to retire.
Well, I think the truth is that there's just a lack of trained people. It's in net number of people working, sure, but in vacancies that are unfilled. This is the biggest problem that we're dealing with in healthcare. We've got a need to hire basically 30,000 more PSWs for the long-term care world. We've got thousands of nursing positions related with that as well. And there aren't nurses you can't beg, borrow, or steal the labor that you need to fill these places. This is a challenge. So,
except we're not begging or borrowing, right? I mean, you said it yourself. I mean, it does come down to money. So, I hear this argument, but there's no short-term fix because you can't just find a crop of thousands of nurses who aren't around. But on the other hand, nobody's going to come into the profession. No one's going to come into the profession. You don't pay them.
Well,
Jenny used to be much more abrupt at interrupting him.
Sorry, yeah, I'll shut up now.
Well, because I'm known to be so polite. That's my MO. Ask anyone.
That's what you're known for.
Yeah. So, look, one of the I think the most innovative things that we brought forward as a commitment in the last election was the pay and stay sort of program where the government will literally pay for your entire nursing education if you will sign a contract to stay in the province for 5 years. And I think that's unprecedented. Like, is there another area of our economy where we will pay for your entire university education if you're committed to staying in that way? So that's the longer term thing. The foreign credential stuff is a real thing, but we have a global shortage. We have a North American shortage. We have a Canadian shortage of healthcare professionals, and this is the issue. So, we need to train more people, and we should have been training more people and seen this coming, a long time ago. And there's, it's not like the sort of demographic issues associated with baby boomers, moving into the healthcare. Requiring more healthcare services is a new phenomenon. We've been talking about this for decades. It's just we're not as prepared as we needed to be, and we don't have the people trained and available to fill those roles. That's a brutal truth.
It is a brutal truth, but another brutal truth is this: a bunch of the things you highlight, and to be fair, that the government has highlighted, are designed to try to provide relief in the longer term. But both in terms of trying to provide a short-term supply fix and I think even in the medium to long term, if you're doing all of these things, but at the same time you're sitting at a negotiating table and saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to pay you 6% and less of CPI, you're going to have a hard time, right? Attracting people to the profession, keeping people in the profession, or maybe even persuading people that they ought to go into the profession, even if you are going to cover their education costs. So I do think, and so I would be banging on the Fed's door, but for more cash. I think
everyone is.
But I would be saying, look, you got to pay nurses more if you want more nurses.
Well,
it's not.
We did a one-time $5,000 bonus just before the election campaign, which is like a 6% raise, something like that. Just then, right? So it's not like the nurses aren't making more money and they haven't been paid more money. But I think some of the challenges, frankly, for people in the system right now is the stress of those working environments, the problems and shortages and things that you're seeing become a compounding problem where it becomes very unattractive to go into work in an emergency room if it's overloaded work environment where you're dealing with high levels of workplace stress, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a lot of things that need to be fixed, I think, simultaneously. Anyone who promises magical solutions in this area, as you guys know, will lie to you about other stuff too. Like they're if it were as easy as pressing this button or pulling this lever over here, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. We have a long-term shortage of healthcare professionals. And, we've got to do a whole bunch of things to try to fix it. But that's the nuts and bolts of it, I think.
Hey, Kory, I got a question for you, though. From the second that Minister Jones opened the door to private delivery options, greater use of private delivery options about a week ago or something like that, I've been asking myself how the hell you got through a campaign without talking about this. When you were planning the campaign, did you anticipate that you would have to deal with healthcare as an issue?
It's just not as a conservative a part of the issue framework that you want to talk about. So, our healthcare plank and our 5 priorities was about a plan to stay open, a plan to not have to go back into lockdown, Because if you were asking people at that time, voters, what were they most focused on? That's what they were most focused on. And so, I think it was the right thing to be discussing in the election campaign because it was the most top of mind issue for folks. But it's not like, we were unaware of the long-term challenges going on. The lockdowns and the approach that we didn't just have to take here in Ontario, but across all of Canada is because we have a system that runs at 99% capacity, and any sort of shock to that system can cause a complete collapse. And we saw that multiple times where you're canceling all elective procedures, where you're basically turning all of your hospital system into a COVID emergency ward. If you want to have an approach of less lockdowns and stuff like, say, Florida, you need to have a healthcare system the size of Florida's. Florida has a bigger healthcare system than all of Canada. It's the amount of capacity there relative, per 100,000 people compared to ours is jarring. We need to, I think, have a 25-30% larger hospital system in Canada than we do today. And I think this is where the federal government's really missing the boat, and where the federal NDP are really missing the boat. People want the things that we're doing now to work. They don't want to have new entitlement programs. And why are the provinces very skeptical of universal farm care programs? Well, it's because you got to fucking pay for what you are already doing, and the federal government isn't. So coming with a pot of money saying, "Hey, new entitlement programs," is really not appreciating the situation that we're in.
Right. I think there's a lot of political jeopardy in there that's being it's being underrated. I agree with you there. But you did a skillful job of walking around David's pointed question. And so in your, but I will flatter you with my own answer to it. And there is a sliding doors, Gwyneth Paltrow with short hair alternative universe where 18 months prior to the provincial election, which you guys rumbled through like thunder, one of the opposition parties made long-term care its sine qua non, and it just pounded and pounded and pounded away on it, and it used the long-term care argument in the context of COVID as a demonstration that the provincial government was failing to place enough priority on healthcare, that the system was fraying at the edges, and the sustained focus on that would have created a dynamic where come the election campaign, they would have earned the right to credibly talk about the fact that you can't trust Doug Ford with the post-pandemic healthcare system, and that he's not addressing those things that are causing decay. And you were never asked to do that, and you were never dealt that challenge. And as you say, that was a frame that you never wanted to enter. Those are cards you never wanted to play. Yep. And it is a condemnation of both the NDP and the Liberals provincially that they did not set themselves up to play that very potent political card.
Well, the NDP could have done it, and I agree that would have been a much smarter play for them. The Liberals, I think, were really in a difficult position. The Wynne government had built 650 new long-term care beds, so it's just such a terrible record on it that there was not a lot of credibility that the Liberals could use to go after us. The NDP didn't have that limitation, and their decision not to do it was a self-inflicted error. It's absolutely, that would have been a huge vulnerability for us. But sometimes you're lucky. You have the good fortune of a weak opposition.
I hear you, man, but I'm telling you this: with an 8-seat result, I would have taken the gamble. I would have flipped the coin if I were the Liberals. I don't think you would have gotten 6 if you had been standing and getting slapped with, yeah, but what about the government that you were a part of? I would take my chances on that as compared to
I think they could have gotten at least 10 if Del Duca had resigned before the before election day.
I don't know why he wouldn't listen to us. It's always our play. Just quit. You'll love it.
Well, Ontario's loss will be Vaughan's gain. So there you go.
Could have been Rosetown. That's where I get Rosetown from. I'm going to do a little explainer here on what it takes to move millions of tons of grain from Canada's rich prairie heartland to population centers across the continent and to ports in the east and west for shipment overseas. Canada's renowned crop is rebounding to normal levels after last year's drought, and moving it will be a pretty big job. Our sponsor, CN, is fundamental to that supply chain. CN has just produced its official grain plan for the year ahead. The railway reckons it will have about 13,500 hopper cars at its disposal. These are the specialized cars with sloping interiors. Grain is loaded through top hatches and unloaded by gravity through bottom outlets. CN is confident its hopper car fleet will be able to handle this year's grain shipments, and it's spending money to expand capacity further, acquiring hundreds of new high-efficiency units. Trains also need locomotives. Again, CN's assessment is that its fleet is up to the job this year, and it's buying more. It recently acquired 57 new high-horsepower locomotives and is taking steps to improve fleet efficiency. But CN's most crucial asset is its railroaders. It needs more of them, particularly train conductors and engineers. Conductors are vital to a train's operation, and they require months of specialized training. Canada has the lowest unemployment rate in decades at the moment, though, and like every other sector of the economy, CN is dealing with a labor shortage. Since the end of 2021, the railway has hired 850 people across its network, most of them conductors. And it's ramping up its recruitment efforts for those excellent jobs, offering signing and retention bonuses and working to expand the pool of potential candidates. Again, CN believes its workforce will be up to the job of moving Canada's grain this year. Further, it's working hard to expand its capability and capacity. The railway is one link in the supply chain, coping with market and climate forces beyond anyone's control. That said, it is committed to working with its customers to ensure Canada's grain is delivered safely and on time. Listen, let's have a little fun with politics for a second. Michelle Rempel wrote a very long analysis piece yesterday on Substack, in which she concluded that Justin Trudeau was either going to call an election this fall or he was not going to be the Liberal leader in the next election campaign. And her two pieces of evidence for this were that Trudeau's star is in decline and can't survive another 2 or 3 years before Election Day. And second of all, that the Conservatives are now united. And so the Liberals don't have a divided Conservative Party to run against. Are those things true?
No, I don't think any of those things are true.
Let's just linger for 1 second on the fact that the Substack was not long, David. Okay? Like, no quarter was a long Led Zeppelin song, okay? Her Substack, it was Old Testament long. Like, it was the Book of Deuteronomy long. It was long. It was like 4,800 words.
Yeah, well...
But I summarized it, I think.
Beautifully.
I think, thank you for meaning that, doing that so others don't have to suffer their way through reading the whole thing. But I think there's wisdom in the Liberals going earlier in an election.
You said this on the podcast right after the election. You said they should go while Poilievre is defined as he is.
I would say it's Chrétien versus Stockwell Day is the play. If you're to look back historically as to what I think the smart play is, but I don't think they're going to do it. But I don't see events coming together in a way that is going to make things easier for the Trudeau government. Like I think we're going to continue to see interest rates ticking up. I think we're going to see some Canadians who are over leveraged, losing homes, losing. Suffering various ways financially associated with higher interest rates. I think if we're seeing a recession starting in the United States, it's pretty rare time where we see an economic downturn in the U.S. that doesn't end up finding its way north of the border as well. This is all bad stuff for an incumbent government to run an election campaign. Like, can any incumbent government in a high interest rate, high inflation, recession environment, really do well in an election campaign? I have a lot of difficulty believing it's there for them if they wait, and those things are only going to be worse the longer they wait. However,
that was kind of our thinking for advocating the last call, which is right. trying to get it in before all this economic stuff started to go down.
Yeah, and I think it was, largely the right call. The pandemic shook the table for everybody, but I think that's kind of in the rear view mirror now, to the point where it's not a driving force in voters thinking the way it was 6 months ago. I guess we'll see, but I think it's an error on their part not going sooner. But I don't think they're going to do it. Now, saying the Conservative Party is united is that's never true. That's like saying any political party is united. That just is never the case. Like, the Liberal Party isn't united right now. The NDP isn't united right now.
Let me just respond to your point right there, Kory, because I know this from personal experience. Because people are going to say, look at how overwhelmingly Poilievre, and this was basically Michelle's point, Poilievre's winning the leadership race overwhelmingly, and that means that all scores are settled and all issues are put to the side. Well, as somebody who worked on a leadership campaign that got 93% of the vote, and I challenged Pierre Poilievre to meet that number. Yeah. As a campaign that got 93% of the vote, that does not mean that your party is united. That does not mean that all factions are gone. That does not mean there aren't people with scores to settle. Any of that. Yeah, no. Well, you're asking to violate the nature of the human mind. It's just this is not how people are. This is not how political organizations operate. There's always going to be all those things. That being said, Pierre's obviously going to have a very strong mandate, and that is meaningful. But it doesn't mean that everybody's united. But I think he'll be in a very strong position. What's going to make him do well, I think, is not that. I think it's this laser-like focus on the economy, which is where I think the electorate's head is increasingly going. He is talking about the things that voters and people are worried about right now. And this is the frustration that you guys have brought up many times about the strategy being pursued by the Liberal Party right now, which I fully agree with your points on. Like, you got to be talking about what people are worried about. People are worried about cost of living related things. They're worried about the economy, and they're not worried about the sorts of soft value issues like around the environment or what pronoun you're using in the way that they might have been when Trudeau first came into office. And I just think he's on the wrong narrative in terms of where the electorate's head's at right now. No, Scott, I know you don't think that they're going to call an election this fall, and you don't think Trudeau's going to leave. But what the fuck is going to happen when he comes back from vacation? Like, what is going on with this government? I mean, I just had a conversation with Kevin Carmichael of the Financial Post about, how we're going through what most Canadians would consider to be an economic crisis. And from Trudeau and Freeland, crickets. Just crickets. I don't get it. No, it's
childcare. You're worried about childcare. Like, that's the answer to affordability. It's laughable. Anyway, sorry, Scott, I'm jumping in on you.
Well, you're just stealing my line, but that's okay. Well, it's worse than crickets, David. I think it's worse than crickets because one, in to underscore the point that Kory was making, it isn't silence. It's a message that seems like it's in competition with what people are feeling, right? Yeah. And second, if you want to know how bad it is, David, here's a little truth track for you, a little splash of cold water. The Prime Minister is back. Okay, he's doing 3 events today, right? So, and he's touring a wind turbine facility, among other things. So, it's hard to hate a wind turbine facility. But Jesus Christ, you got to take a long rhetorical journey to get from renewable energy helps us with climate, helps us recruit and attract investment in jobs. Therefore, the cost of living is going to go down at some point in the future. When? I don't know. Let's get this turbine built. So, it's that to me is the challenge, but I'll go back to it. For all of that, I say, because I'm frustrated by the cards I see them playing, my fundamental quarrel with Michelle's analysis and others who've said this is if you think that Trudeau's star is dimming, then you got to point into the cloudy night sky and tell me which star is glowing. Because I don't see, and we've had this discussion over and over and over again. When you say, I don't think he's going to leave, well, I'm also saying I don't want him to leave. like as a Liberal, right? I know he's dented. I know he's bruised. And I know right now he doesn't seem to be playing, full tackle football. But I also know that when he wants to put the pads on, he's more effective than any other player on the Liberal sideline. And as we've talked about before, he might be the only guy that can actually play ball in Quebec. I don't believe that Melanie Joly, and I sure as shit don't think that Christy Freeland is going to sweep and be competitive in Quebec, especially in the aftermath of a thumping Legault victory, where he's going to feel even more pronounced about being the master of his own house. And so I think the lesson that Michelle draws is that if Trudeau doesn't, if he doesn't call an election soon, then that means he's not running. I draw a different election. I draw a different sort of intuition, which is if he doesn't call an election soon, he's staying longer. Because I agree. Like, I don't think he should call an election right now. I think the deal that he has with the NDP in a weird way kind of handcuffs him. He needs some, and I know we can all say, well, people don't care about this stuff, but we saw in the last election, it can be awkward, especially when you're an incumbent with the dents that Trudeau has. If you look like you're just doing something out of sheer political opportunism, I think it's difficult for him to argue I'd like to pull it, right? And also they haven't built up, because they haven't listened to us and they don't agree with us, presumably, therefore. They haven't been pounding away on Poilievre and saying, all right, so that you get on the other side of September 10th and say, well, Jesus Christ. If this guy's going to take us down this road, then let's let voters decide. Let's have a square off.
But you could do that, Scott. You could do that even still. Because
it's a lot harder than I think we give.
Poilievre gives you a lot of territory right now to shoot at and to fight at. And he's going to come out of the leadership bullish and trash talking Trudeau like you can't believe. And, I think my belief is early election calls are only damaging to the incumbent when there's evidently no reason for it other than the political interest of the government, right? But after this this Poilievre campaign's been hugely impressive. I think you could say to people, listen, he thinks he's hot shit. He's got all these ideas about change. Let's have the fight right now. Let's have the conversation. Let's have at it.
Yeah.
I think that could immediately subsume the early election thing.
I think you have to walk him into
O'Toole was such an inoffensive alternative that it didn't really work in that context.
But I think you'd have to walk him into a box canyon in the same way that Chrétien did with Day, right? I think you'd have to say, all right, you know what? We're putting a couple of things into the House and we're going to have an argument and a debate over them. And then Poilievre ends up firmly and aggressively on one side of them. And then you say, you know what? These questions are not incidental. These questions actually speak to a broader fundamental vision of, where are we going? What are we all about? So fuck it. Let's just drop the gloves and go. But you got to procure that.
Let's see if Poilievre calls for an election.
Well, I think that's an interesting
because
question.
Stockwell Day did, and Lester Pearson did, and in both cases, the incumbent said, "You want it, you got it."
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think the public doesn't give a shit about when you have an election call. Like that is over on the third day of the campaign, no matter what. So, I think you just have to decide whether you want to do it or not.
As long as you make the election about something. The lesson the first 2 weeks of last time was when you made it about nothing, then people go, well, I guess it's about you. So I'm pissed.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. And I think probably the best territory for the Liberals is still to try to have it on values issues to some extent, despite the fact
competence. You wouldn't go on competence? Managerial competence?
Well,
I'm joking.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, right.
Passports. Let passports be my referendum.
You got to get my passport first. But I think the absolute sweet spot is if you can try to put a spin on values and also how you're addressing the economic things that people are worried about. So this is, what is Freeland's plan to help people dealing with inflation without creating more inflation in the process? So just giving everybody, pouring more money into the system will I think objectively make it worse. But at least it would be doing something. So this is the conundrum I think they have. Like how do you draw a difference where you say we're going to address the things that are top of mind problems for Canadians right now, which is inflation, interest rates, etc., and also have a value spin on it that that's going to push people towards your ballot.
You've raised a really important point. They can't do it. They couldn't possibly do it before having some version of your license plate rebate thing. they got to get some money out the door to people before they do.
Well, I'll actually harken back to the healthcare thing we were talking about earlier, because I think those things that are very tangible are really important. Like my view for the government or any government wanting to deal with healthcare reform or any other issue is you got to find examples of things that you can do that are really going to touch a lot of people. So, for instance, on healthcare, why do you have to go and get a prescription for an asthma inhaler or for for insulin or for antibiotics for UTI? These are things that are affecting hundreds of thousands of people that are a needless cost in the healthcare system. But you got to do something that is an example of reform that touches lots of lives. That's why the license plate thing worked well. I don't know what the equivalent of that is on this for the federal government. But it's probably in those kinds of areas where it's service fees or stuff like that. Like I don't know, if you want to make a better story on the passport stuff, waive the fees on the fucking passports. Like, why am I paying $100 or whatever to not get a passport? Why don't you just do that for free for the next while? I don't know.
I made the same point last week, right? Like I said, literally, we should be borrowing from your example and saying, look, there are, I don't know, you tell me, 30, 40, 50 places where the federal government actually is responsible for fees that people have to pay, not other levels of government, right? And so look at that layer of direct fees and say, we're cutting them all in half for 2 years, or we're cutting them 100%. But just say we're relieving that burden where we can. That's one step. But I want to throw out a question to you guys, or a thought, because there's an underlying point of departure in Michelle's piece that we all are sort of implicitly agreeing with, which is that things get harder, that this economic and cost of living crisis and challenge that might migrate, almost certainly will migrate into at least a technical recession, if not something more more burdensome, that all of that is terrible news for the government. All of that makes it very difficult for an incumbent, and that the government is freighted with this. And a part of me wonders if the government doesn't really agree. If this government actually is looking at some of the data over the last little while, and I know core inflation still has remained strong from earlier this week, but I wonder if they look at it and they say, listen, Kory's right. The trick is we have to fight inflation without adding to inflation. So a bunch of additional stimulus, cutting a bunch of, that's just going to, whether it's a tax cut or a bunch of spending, right? So we're just going to keep saying that there's a bunch of stuff that's in the pipe, it's coming down, and we're sticking with it. We actually are seeing a massive correction in the housing market. We think, as blunt as those instruments are, interest rates, it seems to be having an effect. Now, the first thing is that sales will come down, then prices will come down, then hopefully that increases affordability and accessibility after a little bit. We're actually seeing that inflation is starting to abate. We're seeing that some things around supply are starting to fix themselves around the world. So you know what? 18 months from now, we're going to be able to look back and say, see, we actually kept our heads cool. When assholes like Reid were saying cut fees and shit your pants and run around, town screaming the sky is falling, we didn't. We kept our head about ourselves. We followed a steady, straight path, and we did not veer from our climate change actions. And you know what? We've actually steered people through this, and now we can have an election. I think it's possible they might think that. I think they might think that they're actually the most recent data and the outlook, some of the outlook now leads them to think that actually they are applying the tonic that remedies.
But is it a tonic, or is it a big pint glass full of fucking poison? Because the stuff they're doing around, for instance, fertilizer use, just coming back from Saskatchewan now, that is going to put upward pressure on food prices for sure. It's making it fucking worse.
I'm not making it because I'm saying I think that
you got to quit watching so much Quick Dick McDick on YouTube, there, Kory, and getting your information. We got to move on.
All right,
if we're going to get this clipping in time.
Sure.
And all right, so Andrew Coyne writes, The race for the leadership of the United Conservative Party of Alberta reached an important milestone last week with the passing of the deadline for new members to join, members mailing in their ballots September 2nd, with results to be announced October 6th, just 7 weeks from now. Which means we are potentially 7 weeks away from a constitutional crisis, the likes of which this country has not seen. Because the frontrunner for the UCP leadership is Danielle Smith, and because the centerpiece of her campaign is a wholly unworkable, flagrantly unconstitutional, and massively destabilizing proposal called the Alberta Sovereignty Act. In brief, the bill, as described in the Free Alberta Strategy, would presume to empower the government of Alberta to ignore any federal laws it deemed invasive of provincial jurisdiction or contrary to Alberta's interests. Kory, is this really the way to win Calgary? I assume this is going to scare the shit out of Calgarians.
Yeah, I first of all, like, it's so not conservative. Like, what would Edmund Burke be saying about this? This is advocating for the fucking French Revolution here. Like, it's a total disregard for the rule of law and the Constitution. Now, this, I actually think I would be going in the opposite direction in many respects. Like, we want to see more respect for the Constitution as conservatives, generally speaking. We want to see the province's roles and rights respected. But I think the conservative approach is to point to the Constitution and ask for greater adherence to it, not to tear it up and tear up the rule of law and tear up the court system. So, yeah, I think it's folly. I think it's radical in the extreme. I think where it's coming from, though, is not radical. Where it's coming from is a very, very, very deep resentment to how Ottawa, especially under this government, has treated Alberta and the prairies generally. I think they have been rubbing salt in the wounds there, as opposed to trying to take an approach on national unity that brings the country closer together. So, it's happening for a real reason. I just think it's a deeply unconservative approach. And I think it's more likely to yield a premiership of Rachel Notley than it is a premiership of Danielle Smith when the next election rolls around.
That's what I assume. Nobody votes for that massive kind of uncertainty. And I don't think people think that's the right direction to be going in.
Well, it gets you more votes and ridings you already have, perhaps. But I don't think it's playing for swing voters, that's for sure. And, does anyone watching Alberta politics over the last few years think that it needs more chaos? Like, right. It's just a never-ending gong show there.
Scott, what's your take on this?
It's not an unpredictable outgrowth of a handful of threads that we've been witness to in our politics over the course of not just last year or two, but maybe the last 25 years. So part of it is an extension of, let's borrow from the lesson of Quebec's sovereignty, a kind of master in our own house philosophy that in some respects, a much more respectful, thoughtful, less insane version was your firewall letter, right? Which still seemed revolutionary and unworkable at the time. In which, by the way, I would mention that your old boss never actually tried to implement as prime minister, right? But you get some of those threads, right? Which at least they were steeped in some sort of intellectual sort of foundation, even if I fully disagreed with it. But then, of course, you get grievance politics. So you get Danielle Smith telling the mob that the mob is right to be angry because they feel disaffected, as Kory says. And then you say, well, you know what? Like Robespierre, let's kill the king. The king must die. The country is to thrive. And therefore, you sort of like to burn all the institutions. But I do think that it's enormously dangerous politically. I don't think Danielle Smith isn't thinking one step ahead because where does this take you? Well, I know how to run the campaign against this, right? First thing I'm going to say is, when you call and the cops can't come because actually the RCMP, which polices your province, says, sorry, we've been told we're no longer the police. We no longer represent law and order. So good luck putting together that alternative police force that may or may not follow any sort of standards or practices. Oh, by the way, your Canada pension plan? Sorry, you actually don't get that because you're putting together your own pension plan. Now that may take 6 fucking years and I don't know, a whole bag of magic and sand to figure out. But in the meantime, you don't have people will not bite on change. They'll be happy to be angry right? The sentiment of anger, which says let's have radical change, but when you actually start to move into, well, let's consider the change, I think that people will balk. But the broader concern that Andrew raises, I think, is a real concern, right? You watch Legault; he's going to come out of this, right? Legault is separating an all but declaration, right? You know, he's increasingly
different term. They call it autonomy.
Yeah. So you've got this, you know, we've moved from separation to sovereignty to autonomy. And so, you know, this is a dumb and inexact, as you would expect from Danielle Smith, a clumsy and inexact way of going about it. But it's going to be picked up. And you see and hear some elements of it in what Pierre Poilievre sells as well, right? You know, I think when people say, look, I'm just going to disregard all of our institutions and the rule of law, you get into crazy conversations. So the federal government needs to respond to it, I think. You know, they shouldn't just sit back and go, it's crazy, it'll defeat itself. I think they should be challenging it.
Yeah, there are good ways and bad ways to challenge things. There's ways that make it better, and there's ways that make it worse. Like my advice to the government would be to, you know, federal government is to actually do some things to alleviate the pressure that's actually pushing this stuff to the forward. Like, you know, spend some time talking about issues and grievances that are real. You know, take a different stance and different position vis-a-vis, you know, core industries that drive the province there, like the energy industry. But we all know that's not going to happen. Stephen Guilbeault is the biggest fuck you for a ministerial appointment that you could make to the province of Alberta. So I just don't see them doing that. So I think, you know,
it doesn't help though. It does. I mean, Jason Kenney is somewhat the author of his own misfortune on this, and Scott Moe is contributing to this. They are running 24/7 negative campaigns against federalism.
Yeah, but I think they also, you know, I think if you were to talk to Premier Moe or Jason Kenney, I think they also know that the unviability of Western separation. You know, it's because BC isn't coming along with you. You have no ports. You have no core infrastructure links to the United States. Really, you know, those rail lines run east-west, not north-south. It's fine to talk tough around this stuff. It's just, you know, is it really viable at the end of the day? And you know, I take a lot of pride in the West. And I think the grievances there are well founded. Like I get where they're coming from. I just don't think it's viable to separate. And I think it's more viable probably for Quebec to separate. You know, for sure, it's more viable for Quebec to separate. Not that I want that to happen either. Like, can we not just work on making the union work? Can we not just be a little bit more respectful? And I think it's always incumbent on the Prime Minister. The responsibility is far greater centrally in order to make the federation work than it is within any one premier's purview. So yes, you're always going to have premiers that are more difficult or more challenging, but we had a lot fewer national unity problems under a Stephen Harper administration than we have under Trudeau, the original OG Trudeau or Trudeau the sequel. They have been, I think, the legacy of Trudeau Senior and the legacy of Trudeau Junior is going to be one of national discord when it comes to our federation.
You know, Justin came into leadership seeming really committed to addressing that differently. Interesting how that's turned out. Hey, listen, we've only got time for a quick hey yous right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The hey yous are about to begin.
So, Scott, fire away.
I have a special hey you this week, particularly with our friend Kory in mind. My hey you is to the Doug Ford belly bee. The bee that flew into Doug Ford's belly. I just want to say, everyone thought it was really funny. They replayed the tape and became a meme. The premier played it for two. Hey, bee, you're not fooling me, you son of a bitch. I know you're a fucking hack. You're a conservative hack, okay? Premier is rolling out fundamental change in the healthcare system. fundamental change in the way in which we structure municipalities and our mayoralty powers. I'm not necessarily against all these changes. I'm just saying there's some big shit going down. And what's everybody talking about? The funny bee that flew into the premier's mouth and down into his big belly. And then he gets to go to, AMO and talk about the bee being in his belly. He got like 4 days of
He handled it well. So
Beautiful.
if your suspicion is that he had a heads up, because I have to say, I would have handled that worse. I'm pretty sure.
To quote the premier, "Holy Christ, you're not fooling me for a minute, B. I know that you were constructed in a lab by Kory Teneycke. It's a fucking brilliant move, Kory."
Well, my friend Brad Wall, whenever things used to get too hot at question period in the legislature, it was time to bring in Gaynor the Gopher to visit the ledge, the Saskatchewan Rough Riders, and whatever the scandal of the day just evaporated in the shadow of the mascot. But
defense. Defense.
Exactly right.
All right, what's your hey you, Kory?
Well, it'll build on what I was just talking about. My hey you would be to the federal government, to the Prime Minister. Try to find some ways to take the temperature down in Alberta. It's I think an important thing for the country, and I think it's your job more than anyone else to make it work. So try to find some kindness in your heart for your citizens who live in the prairies.
Excellent. My hey you goes out to the mayor of Peterborough, who, when a bunch of QAnon types responding to the Queen of Canada went down to the police station to start doing citizens' arrests of police officers, she was asked for her reaction to this, and her reaction was, "I hate giving airtime spotlight to these imbeciles. Here's my comment. Fuck off, you fuckwads." Well, Diane Therrien, from all of us here at the Curse of Politics, a shout out to you, because that's political communication right there.
That's as on brand for this podcast as you can get.
Right on. We got to have her on the pod.
No
Throwing
kidding.
fireballs. Love it.
All right. Thank you both for joining. Kory, thanks for taking time out of your schedule to do it. It's great. And hopefully those flock of viewers will have come with you. And I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and everybody who watched or listened this week. We'll be back next week with more Curse of Politics. Until then, take care of yourselves.
Thank you.
See you, Kory.
See you guys.
See you guys.